Hello, welcome to another installment of Modern Western Buddhism. Today we're going to be covering Stabilizing Meditation, which is the core practice of training in meditation. It is one of the two major branches of meditation described in most Buddhist systems, and without it you can't do the other major branch of meditations described in Buddhism. So it's extremely, extremely important. Without further ado, let's cover in a brief way, the material that we covered last time. So last time we discussed time management, and essentially what I was making the argument for is this. If you were to move to a permanent retreat or a semi-permanent retreat, in other words, if you were to move to a remote location to do structured training for an extended period of time, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be. Or if you were to ordain and move into a monastery that is remote, where there's a great deal of actual meditative training going on, in addition to prayers and memorizing sutras and commentaries. But even if there wasn't a great deal of meditation going on, if you simply moved into a monastic environment, what you'd find is that there is, for those who are willing to do the work, at least an extremely rigorous schedule of activities that is, in some cases, foisted upon you. You don't have a choice if you want to stay in the system, or at least it is an option for those who, in some cases, people have graduated a certain amount of the material in the monastic training system and they've moved on to do some sort of administrative task in the monastery, and they don't actually have to go to all the prayers and all the meditations and all the pujas and so on. So in any case, there is a disciplined schedule available to you. In other words, you don't have to keep in your head, here's when I'm waking up, here's when I'm going to bathe, here's when I'm going to eat, here's when I'm going to stop eating, here's when I'm going to take a break, here's when I'm going to memorize texts, here's when I'm going to debate, and so on. Yes, there's some flexibility in a monk or nun's schedule, such that they can design some of their own activities as they see fit. One of my current teachers, for example, Geshe Namdak, is renowned for basically doing retreat during all of his free time. So anytime he got time off from his study program, he went into retreat, according to people who were around during his formal education. So in any case, there is sort of an outside pressure of discipline on your activities if you're in a formal retreat setting or a remote retreat setting under the guidance of someone who's helping you do that remote retreat. And if you don't create some semblance of that in your ordinary life, I don't see how it's possible that you're going to gain any type of meditative realization, right? A lot of people think that meditation leads to some sort of like, yeah, man, whatever, I'm open, man, we can do whatever you want, man, it's all good. Like some sort of floppy, whatever kind of state of mind. And nothing could be further from the truth. What is it about making the mind highly alert, highly fresh, highly aware of what's going on, highly concentrated, highly disciplined, that makes you think that you're going to become a whatever man kind of person? That these are completely opposite frames of mind. A mind that is highly aware of what's going on is going to be effective at what it does. It's going to be highly effective at what it does. So this is a very, very important point. Until you make yourself into sort of a conventionally functional and capable person, it's going to be extremely difficult to elevate the level of capability and the level of functionality beyond what an ordinary person already has. Because Buddhist psychology is what's called a wellness psychology. It's a psychology for people who are already fairly well adjusted. It's not meant to handle abnormal psychological problems. It's meant to take a person with a normal level of neurosis and give them extraordinary capabilities, or to reveal the extraordinary character of the mind as it already is, depending on how you want to talk about it. So, all that being said, it's extremely important that you not brush off this part of the work. You need to make yourself capable in the ordinary sense. And part of being capable in the ordinary sense is scheduling your activities, knowing what you need to do, when you need to do it, and how much time you have to devote to each thing that you're doing in your life, and then using each chunk of time that you have in an effective way, a highly effective way, more effective than the average person. So that's really what this first section of, well, how do I do meditation? What's the secret? How do I make really fast progress? Well, if you want to make really fast progress, it's not just about doing more. It's about doing as much as you can in your life in an effective, focused manner, right? Which means that you need to get rid of as much distraction from each activity that you're engaged in as possible. Now, within the limits of your capability, because maybe your disposition currently is not such that you can just eliminate all distractions, schedule your life, and fully focus in each block of time. That's an extremely demanding kind of thing. However, if you look at the examples of so many great meditators who have come out of retreat and are now living sort of more or less ordinary lives, either ordinary lives in the sense that they are monks and nuns living an ordinary monastic life, or they are lay people. So many of those great beings, if they're not showing sort of the crazy yogi kind of appearance, have rigorous schedules, extremely rigorous schedules. I believe the Dalai Lama's schedule's online. I've never looked it up, but I've heard from other people that if you try to live the schedule in terms of training, study, and just general time demands that the Dalai Lama puts on himself every single day, that within a week you'll completely burn yourself out. He operates at an extremely high level of capability. When you look at some of the other Tibetan meditators, you'll see that they usually have a very consistent kind of set of behavior, right? They get up at 4 a.m. They do 4 hours of, or maybe an hour or 2 hours or whatever of their current tantric commitments or training commitments. And then they study for 4 hours. And then, I can't remember who this was, but one Tibetan Lama said, well, if anybody shows up at around 10 o'clock, then they'll hang out and they'll talk and give teachings. And otherwise, they just keep studying until about noon. Then they have lunch, right? And then after lunch, this particular Lama would do, I can't remember how many they would do each day. I think it was 20,000 mantra repetitions each day right after lunch. And then they would take a break and go for a walk, right? So even these highly realized beings, they have these extremely demanding, rigorous schedules, but they also schedule in rest and breaks and flexible time where if this happens, then I do this, and if that happens, then I do that, right? So we need to follow these examples and not just have these completely free-form kind of do-whatever lives, because discipline, mental discipline, emotional discipline does not look like a do-whatever kind of life, right? It is a highly capable kind of life. So the tools that I gave you last time are a calendar, right? If you're not using a calendar, start using one. put both your regular tasks, things that you do all the time, every week. Don't get weird. You don't need to put your daily stuff on there if there's something like brushing your teeth that you do every day or taking a shower. But on your calendar, you need to have both the regular stuff that you do, like if you do martial arts twice a week, you need to have that on there, and the non-regular stuff. So if you're going to a conference or you have somebody coming into town, that should be on your calendar, so that almost nothing of the regular stuff or the odd stuff that comes up that you have to do has to stay in here. Which means what? Which means that you can focus on each block of time without concern for what's coming next, which is an extremely important meditative tool. In terms of task management, I gave you a tool basically saying if you have a project of some kind, you need to have a project document for that thing. If you're repairing your house, if you're trying to get done some type of big practice commitment, if you have a project at work, if there's something big and complicated you need to do for your family, put it into a formal document of some kind. And then you have notes on it. You have all the tasks listed that need to be completed for that. You have the ones that you're working on listed with dates for when they need to be completed. And then you have a list of items to be started and a list of tasks that you've already completed, right? I told you how to use these tools. So when you wake up each morning, after you get done with sort of your morning practice commitments, study commitments, making a meal for your family or whatever the case may be, then you check your email, you check your project documents, you check your calendar, right? So the first chunk of time of your day is looking at what is coming up this week, maybe even this month, that is going to require time to be allocated to it today, right? And so that from 9:30 to 10:30 today, I'm going to be doing X because X has to be done. You see? And because it's all organized, you don't have to worry about, is there going to be time for A, B, C, D all the way through up to X, because it's already on the schedule. You already know how much time it's going to take by and large within the realm of reality and so on. Prioritization tools. So I gave you basically a lot of sort of mental things to work with, right? What do you need to do today? What has to be done today? What has to be done this week? What has to be done this month? What do you need to get done this quarter? What do you need to get done this year? What do you need to get done for 5 years? What do you need to get done in the next decade? What do you need to get done in this life? What do you need to get done for the sake of your next life? What do you need to get done for the sake of all your future lifetimes? What do you need to get done for the sake of all sentient beings? Right? So these are the tools mentally that you need to start building into, well, what is it I'm going to do from 9:30 to 10:30 today? Right? Because a huge number of the things related to preparing for the moment of death, preparing for the next life, preparing for all of your future lives, preparing for the capability to be a benefit to all beings, which is quite grandiose, don't seem as urgent as your taxes. So you need to make sure that you are scheduling in and building into your life all of these pieces, right? And that's going to require you thinking about it up front. Then we talked about you've scheduled your life, you know sort of when you're going to be doing what chunks of stuff. But real life happens right in the midst of all this planning that you've done. Real life happens. So how do you handle interruptions? Well, there are a number of tools you can use. The big one is if there's an interruption coming from the outside, right? And you've already done a lot to minimize interruptions from the outside. But when interruptions come from the outside, how do you handle those? Well, the big one that you really, really want to get your mind around is this. More or less, if something is going to take 2 minutes or less, then go ahead and get it done, right? Don't keep it spinning around in your head until you get done with the current thing. If it's 2 minutes, just knock it out, right? Just get it done. If you can delegate it right away so that it's off your plate and out of your mind. If it can't be delegated and can't be done in 2 minutes, then immediately put it on your calendar or in the appropriate project document so that at the appropriate time you know it will happen and you can let it go. You can get it out of your mind. If you're in the midst of an activity that you cannot interrupt because that would be inappropriate, then put it out of your mind because you can't deal with it until you get done with the activity, right? In terms of inside interruptions, the biggest ones are that we get tired, and managing fatigue and what they would simply call in Buddhist psychology lethargy, right? Or sometimes they call them just obstructions generally, just obstructions. More or less, this is referring to you getting physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, or sluggish so that your mind won't learn, right? Or that your body is so tired, sluggish, filled with pain or whatever that you can't focus on what it is you're doing. So one of the big ways to overcome a huge number of the problems that you have in regards to study and training activities is to sleep properly, which seems really absurd, but unless you have the ability to access the fourth formless or the fourth form dhyana, then you don't have the ability to replace your sleep with meditation. Given that most people watching this probably can't hold an object in their mind or hold their mind on their breath for 30 seconds, the likelihood that anytime soon you're going to be able to replace sleep with your meditative practice is like absurd to the vanishing point. So sleep properly. More or less, get your sleep on a schedule so that you're sleeping between 6 and 8 hours a day according to your biological need. If you sleep too much, you will build up lethargy. If you sleep too little, you will build up lethargy, right? So pay attention. What amount of sleep is it on a given day that is leaving you feeling mentally and physically refreshed? That is the goal, right? Then we talked about dopamine detoxing. So more or less what I'm really saying here is every day you get a certain amount of happy juice, right? Your brain produces a bunch of happy chemicals. It only produces a certain amount. If you spend and spill all that juice on obsessive social media use and on porn and on watching an absurd amount of television and shows and all of this, or in video games, in particular games where you are, really first-person shooters are probably the worst of the bunch because it's all twitch, right? It's all extreme attachment, anger, and just excitement, right? So it is literally cultivating the opposite of the frame of mind that you're trying to enter into. But I digress. The point is that if you spend all of your happy chemicals on sort of easily obtainable pleasures, then when you do the right stuff, like when you sit down and you do your daily session, blah, 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 there's not going to be much chemical reward that your body and mind can give you because you've already spent it all somewhere else. So be skillful here. If you need to play some games to relax or watch some television to relax or whatever it is you need to do, fine, right? Within your level of capability, do less of the stuff that is deeply actually neurotic kind of behaviors, right? Start to phase these things down. Do the least damaging versions of them that you can manage at this point, right? So if you're looking at something really, really horrible and that's the only way for you to get aroused, maybe try to take it down a notch from there and look at something else. and then eventually take it down a notch from there and look at something else, a little more mild, and then take it down a notch from there and don't look at anything at all, right? So work with yourself to phase out your worst problems. Then we talked about how to divide up your time effectively within a block of time, right? So within a particular block of time, if you're working on something extremely detailed, demanding, and basically mental dullness inducing, where it just makes you like, within 20 minutes, your brain's like, oh, right? Any activity of that kind, and study very often is one of those activities. Use the Pomodoro Technique. So the Pomodoro Technique, you do 25 minutes of the activity, and you can wiggle that to between 20 minutes and 35 minutes, right? Probably no less than 20 minutes. And then you take a 5-minute break. And when you're taking a break, you fully take a break. You step away from the material. You don't think about it. You don't continue ruminating on it. You don't, right? You try to fully relax for 5 minutes. And then you come back to the activity. Why? Because basically from the point of view of Western psychology, and honestly also from the point of view of Tibetan psychology, if you just keep stubbornly kind of driving at the activity, the benefit goes like this. The curve is like, right? So you get like 15 minutes of really good study, and then you kind of plateau, and then immediately it drops off and you get nothing. If you take punctuated breaks that are real breaks from the activity, and then you go back, then you start from here again, right? And you get the full benefit. It starts to trail off, and you take a break. And then you ramp up, you start to get the benefit again, and then it starts to trail off, and you take a break. So that you're constantly staying as high on the benefit spectrum of the training, the sort of study or training activity as you can, right? And this actually works quite well for physical training also. There are quite a number of martial arts things where if you take basically 25-minute blocks of training with small breaks in between, where you're really resting, the benefits can be quite profound because you're putting everything you have into a small block and then taking a real rest and then putting everything you have in again. So sincerity is really the important thing in both of these techniques. The second one I call the Jones technique. It's actually a modification of the daily schedule that you would work if you worked for a major financial institution. And this works quite well only under a particular circumstance. So in a circumstance where you are in the zone, where you're in the flow, you're studying something and it seems like a breeze, right? You're like jamming with the material. Then in the midst of feeling like you're really getting after it and it's so good, it's so easy, you know, and yeah, some stress is building up, but man, you know, it's really coming along. Take a 15-minute break. Somewhere in the midst of that flow, probably when the stress gets to like just before it seems like the stress is going to overtake the enthusiasm, take a 15-minute break. And that 15 minutes, let it be a real break. Don't do anything related to the material. Again, when you rest, fully rest. Within every 2-hour block, 15 minutes of rest will occur somewhere at your discretion. In the second 2-hour block, take a 30-minute break for food, which means that every 4 hours or so, you're going to have a food break for 30 minutes somewhere in that 4-hour block. Within the next 2-hour block, another 15-minute break somewhere. And then the last hour, you just push it out, right? So that gives you 8 hours of work, 1 hour where you're resting, so kind of floating within there, and 1 meal in the midst of those 8 hours. Now you can do 2 of these sort of sessions back to back, or maybe 2.5 if you're feeling quite enthusiastic, or you're completing some kind of study requirement for a retreat, for example. A couple odds and ends. If you get fatigued because you're reading a book, then if you can find that same book in a digital format, then read the book on your computer. If you get tired reading it on the computer, go back to the text. If you get tired of the text again, then go to your phone and read it on your phone, right? I call this medium fatigue. Sometimes just changing the medium, or basically the source that you're reading something from, can refresh the mind. Because part of the reason the mind is locked up or not fresh is that it's been staring at the same sort of physical object for quite some time. So do what you can in that way to keep the mind quite elevated, right? The point is to keep the mind fully engaged. You want full-heartedness, not half-heartedness. Finally, physical fatigue. The best advice for physical fatigue is when you're studying, sit with appropriate posture, right? We will cover posture extensively later on, but sit appropriately. If you sit with good posture, you will have much better, much more comfortable studying and training. If the mind is sort of getting foggy because the body is getting kind of collapsed and, right? The body and mind both mirror one another. So if you can refresh the body, the mind has a chance also to become refreshed. So how can you accomplish managing your physical fatigue in the midst of certain types of study and training? Well, if you have a physical text, you can stand up and walk around while you read the text. Or you can put the text down during one of your 5 or 15-minute breaks, and you can do some martial arts, you can do some dance training, you can do some yoga, you can do some jumping jacks or some push-ups, whatever it is that basically blasts the stagnancy, right? The stagnant kind of sluggish feelings out of the body, do that. So you want to keep the body quite alert and awake and fresh in the midst of your study activity. In terms of general advice, exercise every day, right? Do some type of exercise. Martial arts, dance, yoga, weightlifting, whatever it is that you want to do. I would recommend martial arts personally, and in particular, I would recommend the internal arts from China, or the internal arts from Japan. But that being said, really any martial art, I would say, is quite good for a number of reasons that we'll cover later on. Finally, rest. Take a rest. Rejuvenate. When you rest fully. When you are resting, try to maintain some recollection of what it is you intended to do. So one of my teachers recently said, and I thought it was hilarious, that most people they're so neurotic they can't even rest properly, right? So they can't focus on their work and work properly when they work, and then they can't focus on their rest and fully rest when they rest. So then they never end up actually working fully nor resting fully. So one of the skills you need to gain in the midst of real training is being able to rest when you rest. So if you're watching a movie, just watch the movie. Put your phone down. Don't check 13 different social media accounts. Leave your email alone. You don't need to have 3 different screens going where you have like the iPad and the phone, and you got the video game on the iPad and you got the phone with social media and you have a movie on, right? Which is how people live now. It's absolutely insane. There's nothing restful about that. You will wake up tomorrow feeling physically a bit better, but mentally shitty because you didn't actually take a break. So when you rest, right? Now, your rest may begin to take the form over time of a different type of training activity, right? So painting, drawing, dance, martial arts, yoga, working with nature, either wildcrafting or gardening. These are all potentially helpful training tools in the midst of the seated training that you hope to be doing at some point. Finally, outside activities. So a lot of training is about saying no, which maybe seems strange, but a lot of training is about saying no, right? You have set up a schedule. You have designed your life now in such a way that you will accomplish your goals in terms of the training that you're trying to do. And then real life will happen. And you will need to say no to a lot of stuff in order to accomplish those things that everyone else won't accomplish. If you commit to doing 8 hours of training a day of various kinds, that means you're going to have to not do a lot of other stuff, right? You're going to have to not do whatever it was that you would have been doing in the midst of those 8 hours. And yet, people will still invite you to do those things. Those things might be readily available if they are things within your home or within a very short distance of your home, etc. And you're going to have to say no, right? So a huge amount of training is just learning how to control yourself, control your impulses, so that you can continue with the training activity without interruption. And so one of the tools that I'm putting in your hands here in terms of scheduling is that you schedule your life in such a way that your impulses are funneled into certain blocks of time. This gives you small chunks where you're basically having to say no to your impulses over and over and over again, which is doing what? It's giving you mental control, maybe for the first time in your life. Right? So this is very profound. If your intent is to shower between 9 and 9:30 every single day, then when you get to 9 o'clock and you go, I don't really want to do this, I'd rather, I just want to play video games, or I just, it's a Saturday and nobody cares, nobody's going to hit me with a whip if I don't do this. No, you just go take the shower, right? Doesn't matter what bullshit pops up in your mind or what call you get, you do the thing you intended to do, which is building up the force of mindfulness, which is actually appropriately translated as recollection, which in technical language is the active act of doing what you intended to do. The active act of doing what you intended to do without forgetting the intention, right? So when you are actively in the act of not forgetting what you intended to do, then you have mental control over whatever's going on. You see it? That's mindfulness. So when you create a schedule and you stop chasing your impulses throughout the course of 16 hours that you're awake every day, well, now you're actually in a process of turning the whole boat in a different direction. So these skills are not like, come on, man, let's get to the real stuff kind of skills. These are the real things. Being able to have consistency in your life, consistency in your training activities, consistency in your behavior is actually the whole path. If you can, from today, schedule out what it needs to be done, and the only thing that will stop you from getting those things done is dying, then you're already on your way, aren't you? It's just a matter of putting the left foot in front of the right. But until you can, with discipline, put the left foot in front of the right, you're not going anywhere, man. You're just going to walk in circles if you keep walking right foot, or left foot, left foot, right? You're going to go in circles. So until you can, with systematic effort, put one foot in front of the other, you're going to veer off in the wrong direction. So this discipline of schedule, discipline of time, discipline of mental energy is the whole path. If you can do this part, you will accomplish the goal. Right? Extremely important. Okay. Let me transition over now. Okay. All right, friends. I know I said that was the whole path and that was the real deal, but let's now talk about stabilizing meditation, right? So first, there are so many terms, right? There are an absurd number of terms. Samadhi, Shamatha, Shyiné, Gom, Bhavana, Dhyana, Jhana. What else? Covering just Sanskrit, Pali, and Tibetan, we could have quite a day. So I'm not sure that I want to disambiguate all of these terms for you because that's quite a project, and frankly I don't know that I'm up to the task with some of these terms. So what I'm going to do is focus on Je Tsongkhapa's presentation. Je Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug order, for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to go over those reasons quite soon. Stabilizing meditation. So in Je Tsongkhapa's presentation, he describes two different techniques of meditation, which he say are basically all there is. He says if you understand these two encompass all other techniques, right? All other techniques are either one of these or they are a modification of one of these. So one of those is shamatha, samadhi, or shyiné, right? So the simplest definition of this is simply single-pointed concentration, but we're going to go into much more detail because it deserves much more detail. That has been translated so many different ways. The translation that I'm going to be using two of them actually. One of them is actually a transliteration, meaning it's trying to capture the meaning rather than the word translation, right? The word-for-word translation of the term shamatha is closer to something like calm abiding. And it's the same word in Tibetan. Shyiné would be calm abiding. So let's take a look at stabilizing meditation or calm abiding. And like I said, we're going to be focusing on Je Tsongkhapa's presentation, so let's talk a little bit about what he did in that presentation, right? So the Gelug tradition mainly relies upon the commentarial works of an Indian monk by the name of Kamalashila, and he lived between 740 and 795 CE. He wrote three major treatises on the process of meditation training, the Bhavanakrama series, right? So the main source for this material in Je Tsongkhapa's work is the second of the series, if I'm not mistaken. Might be the third. Not so important. In any case, that's the main sort of source for Je Tsongkhapa's teachings, although he quotes a huge number of different sources, right? So he quotes numerous sources, including Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Sutra of Cultivating Faith in the Mahayana, the Sutra of Unraveling the Intended Meaning, the King of Concentration Sutra. And these works that he's quoting range from 80 BCE, which is among the very earliest of the texts that still exist, Buddhist texts that still exist. By the way, the very first Buddhist text that we have still, right, physical text that still exists is a Mahayana Prajnaparamita Sutra, not a Pali Sutta, right? Even though we have good reason to think that the Pali Suttas are among the oldest sutta sources that we have, spoken word sources that we have. The Prajnaparamita Sutras, some of them are quite old, right? At least as old as the oldest Pali Suttas. So, in more general terms, my bigger background is religious studies as an academic. So I get to read a sort of absurd amount of different religious material from all over the place. And I can tell you without a doubt that stabilizing meditation or calm abiding is discussed explicitly and implicitly within almost every major tradition on earth. Right? So you find it in Hindu literature, obviously. That's the origination source for all of the sort of major technology of the samadhis, of the stabilizing meditation. You find it in the Jain sources. You find it in Sikh sources. You also find it in the Western esoteric traditions, the Kabbalists, the Sufis, the Christian contemplatives. So the major Abrahamic faiths have versions of these. And then, of course, the Taoists share much of this technology in common because the Chan and Taoist teachings tend to be quite close in a number of regards. Although I'm beginning to think more and more that the Taoists have more in common with the Bon practitioners than the Chinese traditions, but that's just a personal opinion. So the value and the process for attaining deeply concentrated states is perhaps among the best attested psychological and spiritual states in human history. In other words, this is, among the spiritual traditions of earth, maybe the most common thing. Maybe the most common thing is doing something physically, verbally, mentally to gain a highly concentrated state. I mean, you find this even in shamanic literature. You find it everywhere. In my mind, concentration is the access way, is the doorway, basically to everything that is described as religious, philosophical in the real sense, the important sense, or spiritual. If you can do concentration, everything else described by religions of the world will occur. So it just, what can occur and what will occur through training and concentration really cannot be understated. It is sort of the access way to everything, the doorway to everything. Je Tsongkhapa also quotes numerous commentators in the Indo-Buddhist tradition of the Nalanda Monastery and the Mahasiddha, which are the great tantric adepts of India, lineages. Also, not just the Nalanda Monastery, but there's also the Burmese tradition, which is Atisha, but I'm forgetting the name of that monastery at the moment. In any case, so he quotes Asanga, he quotes Shantideva, he quotes Ratnakarasanti, he quotes Atisha, and a huge number of the old Kadampa masters and so on. So Je Tsongkhapa is relying in a scholarly sense in what we would call primary sources, which are those writing about their own direct experience, right? And secondary sources where there are students of those who are writing from their own experience, commenting on the works of their teachers and so on, who also gained those realizations relying upon their teachers' words, right? So Je Tsongkhapa is relying on primary sources and sutras, as well as a lot of commentarial material. In addition to that, Je Tsongkhapa is renowned in the Tibetan tradition for refusing to write down anything in terms of training instructions until he fully realized those teachings himself. So Je Tsongkhapa spent, I think it was 4 years at one point in meditative retreat, and he refused to write down much of this material until he had gained the realizations himself so that he could reference his own experience in the writing of the teaching. So, based upon these teachings also, many subsequent Gelug adepts have gained the same realizations that Je Tsongkhapa attained, including notable notable Gelogs that are fairly recent, like Jepabongka Rinpoche, and quite recently Choden Rinpoche, who spent 19 years in solitary retreat. So this stream of instructions is extremely powerful. It has a proven track record, and it was written by someone who was relying upon their own direct meditative experience, in addition to the verifying sort of experiences of other great adepts, including the words of the Buddha. So this presentation is also going to include some Chan/Taoist sources, some Zen approaches to the same state of mind. And the reason for that is, I think, fairly straightforward, that the Tibetan tradition, by and large, is written by monks and nuns for monks and nuns. It is, by and large, not written for lay people, whereas the Taoist, Chan, Zen traditions were quite often aimed at a wider audience and adapted for a wider audience. And so that can be quite helpful in that way. Also, there is some sparse, from what I understand. Again, I'm not a tantric practitioner, but from what I understand, there are some techniques that are taught elsewhere that would require empowerment in the Tibetan tradition, yet they are sort of openly taught or fairly openly taught in other places. And I think it's helpful, to understand some stuff of this kind as you're sort of making your way through. So in a very general way, I'm going to cover that stuff, right? Very, very general. Regarding the term meditation. Oh, yes, okay. So this is a big subject, right? The term meditation in English comes from the Latin term meditatio. If you'd like a sort of historical overview of how this term has been used in the West, the Routledge Handbook of Yoga and Meditation Studies has an excellent chapter called Meditation in Contemporary Context, Current Discussions. Huskaffel. Really excellent if you'd like to know the history of the term. But basically, in English, this term is so diverse, right? If you say I meditate, you might as well say I play sports. Because the next question should be, what do you mean? What sport do you play? It's a quite reasonable question, right? Because some people think chess is a sport. Some people think rugby is a sport. Some people think chasing wheeled cheese downhill is a sport. And some consider egg tossing a sport. So these very diverse kind of different things can be considered to be sport by different groups of people. And so what is it exactly that qualifies all these things as sports? That's really hard to say, isn't it? The English word meditation is similarly vague and broad and inclusive. Meditatio, meditation. It seems to encompass everything from aromatherapy to visualizing yourself as an eagle flying over the Grand Canyon to sitting down and reading a book in a quiet room, right? So it's really important that we get specific when we're talking about meditation. And here, in this particular presentation, the term meditation is going to focus entirely on really not just the one term, but two terms, right? It's going to focus on gom, which means to become familiar with, or familiarization. Gom is a Tibetan transliteration of the Sanskrit term bhavana, and bhavana literally means to call into existence, to bring something into existence. But what it implies is mental development or cultivation, right? It implies bringing a mental quality into existence or making the mind familiar with something in the mind or about the mind that's already there, or to familiarize the mind with a beneficial object or a beneficial subjective state, right? So this term gom or bhavana can be quite usefully thought of as familiarization, to a process of becoming familiar, directly familiar with something through experience. In part, maybe in the beginning, conceptually becoming familiar, but ultimately becoming familiar with something through direct experience. Now, within Gom or Bhavana, there are two major types, right? And we're only going to be talking about one of them. So we're not going to talk about Lakdong or Vipassana, right? We're not going to be discussing that. We're going to be focusing on Shyiné, right? So Shyiné, Samadhi, Shamatha, these can be literally translated as Shi, meaning calm or peaceful or peace, and Ne, to abide, to stay. So literally the translation of Shamatha or Shyiné is basically to calmly abide, right? Something is peacefully staying where it was put. Samadhi is more directly thought of not just as stillness or peacefulness, but samadhi is thought of as a state of mind. Samadhi really means to collect together, which means that you're taking all of your attentional energies, right? All of your mental faculties, including the visual, auditory, smell, taste, touch, and you are collecting them all into one place until there's just one thing occurring in attention. So that all of the attention of the entire psychophysical system is concentrated on one point, one thing. That's really what samadhi means. Shyiné and Shamatha are referring to the same state of mind as samadhi. So serenity meditation is another translation for this term, Shyiné, Shamatha. Serenity really is emphasizing the peaceful and even the blissful aspect. The blissful aspect we'll talk about in more detail later on. Stabilizing meditation emphasizes the aspect of controlling attention, which I think does more justice to the wider body of literature, including sort of things like samadhi, right, which are deeply related terms. In this text, I'm going to use both calm abiding and stabilizing meditation as synonyms. So what is stabilizing meditation then? So it has the effect of bringing all of one's mental, conceptual, emotional activity under control. The mind goes where you want, when you want it to go there, and it stays there for as long as you want. The advanced practitioner can sit comfortably in a highly concentrated state for days, weeks, or months without need for rest, food, or water. We're going to discuss that at some length below. Now, before we get into this, which is quite a big claim that we're going to do some justice to, let's just think for a moment about this part of the definition, right? The mind goes where you want, when you want, for as long as you want. So previously we talked about study skills, being able to listen to something, to digest that teaching, and to contemplate it properly so that it becomes part of what you are and not simply an idea in your head. So already you were able to put the mind where you want. It mostly stayed where you wanted it, and it stayed there until a particular result occurred that you wanted to occur, right? You became a new thing. You used to be really impatient. You heard that there was a way to not be so impatient. You studied and thought about that a lot. You did the familiarization process for developing patience, and now you are a patient person, right? Okay, so this is sort of a small example of getting the mind to go where you want, when you want it to go there, and to stay there for as long as you need it to or want it to, basically until the results of whatever the type of training occur in your experience, right? So this is Shyiné. We also talked about scheduling your life. You think you're going to get your mind to go where you want, when you want, and stay there for as long as you want, when you can't even abide by a schedule every day? Give me a break. When you can't even get your body to go to the locations you want it to go to, and you can't get it to do it on time, and you can't get it to dress in the appropriate clothing and to show up like having taken a shower within the last 48 hours, but you think that you're going to do some advanced meditative training? Come on. It's a joke. You need to have ordinary competence in your life before you're going to have any success at getting your mind to go where you want, when you want, and stay there for as long as you want it to stay there, right? So hopefully you're starting to see these connections. The second type of meditation, Hlatong, clearly seeing clearly, is the Tibetan term for vipassana, correct insight, or vipassana in the Pali. The Pali, vi meaning special or extraordinary, passana meaning seeing. So seeing in a special or extraordinary fashion. Super seeing, supra seeing, right? However, seeing in this context really means discernment, right? In other words, you are discerning by directly looking at something what is the nature of this thing, right? By looking at it in intense concentration, one comes to see what it is actually like in the absence of all of the normal bullshit we have going on in our head. Now, I tend to like, even though clear seeing or seeing clearly or special insight are really good direct translations, I tend to like analytic meditation for this term, because actually what you're doing in an analytic meditation, according to the great yogis, is extremely subtle types of conceptual analysis and extremely subtle non-conceptual types of analysis. In other words, you're directly looking at an apple, right? And you may go, okay, brown stem, green leaf, red thing. What is the red aspect? Is the red aspect this or is it that? Is the brown aspect this or that? Is the green aspect this or that? And so there's a very subtle conceptual process going on, right? Or in a highly concentrated state, the conceptual division is not occurring, and you are looking at all of the pieces appearing in a vivid state of concentration without dividing up all of the pieces into conceptual categories and doing a highly focused conceptual analysis anymore. You've already done that at some point. You've already done a lot of that. And now, simply by more or less recalling the image or looking at the image, the correct information occurs with that image or shortly thereafter, without needing to go through the conceptual aspects of the analysis, right? And the special insight, the supra seeing, the super seeing, is seeing in the absence of all the normal crap that you have going on in your head. But obviously much more technical, much more involved than that. Right. So Jason Kappa distinguishes between calm abiding and special insight meditation basically on the basis of discursiveness, right? So calm abiding is a mind that does not conceptualize. It does not differentiate. It does not conceptually distinguish the exact particulars of an object. So it is not going brown thing, green leaf, red circular thing, shiny part of the apple, right? It doesn't do any distinguishing of the particulars of that object as it appears, right? It simply observes without differentiating. It brightly cognizes what is occurring without differentiating between the aspects. When one's doing analytic meditation, again, one can be differentiating between the aspects either conceptually or non-conceptually, but it must be in the context of a mind that can maintain single-point concentration. So there is no vipassana without samadhi or shamatha or Shyiné. So forget about vipassana until you can get the calm abiding, right? These two forms of familiarization encompass all other techniques for cultivating and revealing beneficial states of mind, just as the branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits of a tree are limitless, yet all rely on the tree's roots. Again, it's also worth noting that a huge number of realizations, full and actual realizations of the Buddhist path, happen before you have accomplished calm abiding. That cannot be emphasized strongly enough. You need a whole host of other realizations first to have the internal wherewithal, to have the character and the discipline and the perseverance, right, to actually gain these subtler states of mind. Without those motivations and without that character underlying the activity of trying to gain samadhi, you cannot do it. It's not possible. So, extremely important point. Also up to and including the valid inference of emptiness, which will be irreversible for this lifetime, and according to Venerable Aryadeva, the main student of Nagarjuna, simply gaining, not even the valid inference, just what they would call correct assumption. In other words, you think emptiness is correct even though you don't have valid reasons to think it, right? You can't prove it, but you're almost entirely positive that emptiness and selflessness of the person are correct, right? That correct assumption will shake the entire foundations of samsara. In other words, you're probably in good shape moving forward from here. So if you can gain the valid inference without calm abiding, which means that you can put yourself in an extraordinary position in this lifetime, almost without a doubt, if you're willing to study hard, right? If you're willing to study hard, put in the work, and do some training in meditation long before you gain calm abiding, samadhi, you can do serious damage to samsara. In a more practical sense, your emotional palate, your internal world can become much more pleasant. So, all very much worth considering. Also worth considering, Lama Tsongkhapa puts this at basically at the end of his pedagogy in terms of training, right? Pedagogy is a fancy word for like steps of training. Calm abiding is an advanced practice. You need a lot of other realizations in order to be successful at this training. That being said, without further ado, here is the critical definition. So this is my definition. My main mentor is sort of his definitions is the basis for this, but it is heavily modified using the teachings of Tsongkhapa, the teachings of Sopa, Geshe-la Sopa, the teachings of Asanga, and a few other sources, frankly. Calm abiding is mental and physical pliancy arising from a highly sturdy, highly lucid, unbiased, and skilled state of mind, which can hold attention uninterrupted on beneficial objects or object for as long as it wishes, while cognizing without conceptually adding or subtracting properties from its object or objects. Mental and physical pliancy arising from a highly sturdy, highly lucid, unbiased, and skillful state of mind, which can hold attention uninterrupted on a beneficial object or objects for as long as it wishes, while cognizing without conceptually adding or subtracting properties from its object or objects. Right? Abhidharma literature also stresses that calm abiding familiarizes with a useful or beneficial object. In other words, that sometimes we have concentrations that are based upon attachment or anger or lust or whatever, and the concentrations, or like some people can play video games. Like I used to do this when I was a kid. You can play a video game and try to beat the same boss in a highly focused state for 20 hours, right? You're just trying to win this one thing. And yes, that is a concentrated state. You have recollection. You're not forgetting what you intended to do. The mind is nice and bright, but it's motivated by intense negative emotions. You're like deeply attached to this thing. You like really want to get this guy, blah, 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 right? And this obsessive attachment that you have to killing this final boss in the video game or whatever, right, means that you're not actually cultivating a beneficial state of mind. Hopefully that's clear. So it's also useful to note that we need to develop motivations that are powerful as these motivations that we have for our attachments and our aversions, right? Some people hate other people or a particular person so much that they will spend years planning revenge on that person in a highly focused way. And they'll make huge sacrifices to make the revenge come about. Or obviously with attachment, I mean, how many romance stories are there on this planet where somebody spends years and years and years planning some elaborate romantic thing in order to win the love of somebody, right? So if we are abiding on useless or counterproductive objects, or we're just obsessively becoming attached or averse to some activity, yes, you can develop concentration that way, but that concentration never gets to the form realm. It never gets to this level, right? Because there's all sorts of things that are wrong with that concentration. So it's not just focus. It's not just concentration. It's not just the ability to keep your mind on a particular object, right? It is mental and physical pliancy arising from a mind that is sturdy and lucid, but also unbiased, meaning that it's not motivated by attachment and aversion, skilled, meaning it is deliberately applying a particular technique. It is focused upon a beneficial object, and it is not adding or subtracting properties from the object that is cognizing. So that will never be accomplished with the types of concentrations we generate based upon delusions or kleshas, right? Very important. Okay. Explaining the definition. So a lot of debate here, but let me see actually. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna start just with this first sentence. We're gonna jump ahead a bit and then come back. So calm abiding is a trained skill rather than an innate ability. Now, this is actually a debate point, believe it or not. But for the sake of sort of the ordinary way of thinking, the ordinary worldlings that we are, it's useful to think about calm abiding as a skill. It's something you cultivate, it's something you do, it's a technique you employ to get certain work done. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not stabilizing meditation is a skill or if it is the natural condition of the mind. I tend to think that if you're employing stabilizing meditation as a technique to accomplish something else, then at that level of the training, you can think about, without any negative consequences, you can think about stabilizing meditation as a technique. It is a skill, a method, an approach, right? It's something that you do to get certain types of work done. For example, You may visualize certain images or engage in Lamrim meditations to get certain types of tasks accomplished. For example, maybe you're trying to, I don't know, develop bodhicitta, right? According to some Gelug sources, you need full calm abiding before you can develop bodhicitta. Okay, so for the sake of that task, right, for the sake of generating bodhicitta, you're going to need the calm abiding, according to the Gelug system. So in the context of using that as a technique to accomplish some other thing, sure, right? That very usefully thought of as a skill. You're going to have, just like learning how to, play the guitar, you're going to have to learn the technical language of playing the guitar. You're going to have to learn some music theory. You're going to have to learn to read the music. You're going to have to learn where your fingers go, or maybe you're playing it by ear, but you're going to have to learn how to hear a note, know what it is, know where your fingers go, know what chord that is, blah, 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 right? It will be a process of acquiring a new skill. However, in Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Zen, Chan, Xian, Tian, I would say arguably also Taoist Zhuowang practice, Hindu Neti Neti, as well as Krishnamurti's choiceless awareness practice. Basically, one is seeking to enter a state of stabilization that is always present, right? One is seeking to gain a state of stabilization that is present in the midst of whatever else occurs, including whatever else occurs in the mind. So at that level, where one is seeking to gain direct access to the conventional nature of mind through using a stabilizing approach, I would say that at that level, we're talking about the nature of consciousness, right? One is accessing the nature of consciousness and trying to abide there in the midst of ordinary activities. So, in the midst of whatever else appears, one is seeking to rest in the thing in which it appears. Maybe too subtle. One is trying to look at the clarity aspect and the luminosity aspect of mind in the midst of things appearing within that clarity and luminosity, right? So one is resting in the nature of consciousness, in the natural condition, the natural state, with focus. However, now this is where it gets interesting. Once you have cleaned up some of the more turbulent things that the mind is getting involved in, and the mind can rest in its own nature, then the stabilization itself is the nature of how the mind is, right? Arguably, that's how the mind was from the beginning, and you just didn't notice. But to me, that's kind of an academic point. Up to that stage, you're going to basically be employing a bunch of techniques and looking at the mind in a great deal, and thinking about the mind a great deal, and doing a lot of basically the work that you would do if you were trying to gain any other skill. So I think stabilizing meditation is best thought of as a skill for us ordinary people. Okay, back to explaining the definition, and then we will carry on. So calm abiding is knowing. What does this mean? It cognizes or familiarizes with psychologically beneficial states of focus. It is not simply becoming thoughtless. It's not simply becoming blanked out. It's not simply removing all specific objects from the mind. That is not what's being discussed in regard to calm abiding. Calm abiding has an object that it knows. And it knows that object with extremely lucid, extremely awake, extremely bright cognitive focus. While it's observing an object with extremely bright awareness, Calm abiding doesn't conceptually add properties to the object, nor conceptually take properties from the object. In other words, the object appears as it is. So, in other words, the mind merely observes without superimposing anything, nor subtracting anything. And the mind isn't analyzing the object. So all bias, conceptually, emotionally, in terms of your past, in terms of your future hopes, are completely absent from the cognition of the object. Due to the absence of thoughts, emotions, concepts, and ideas, the mind temporarily stops all gross habitual, meaning coarse, all coarse, obvious, habitual, and emotional conceptual biases. The conceptual division between the meditating mind and the meditation object also temporarily subsides. So you've heard a lot of literature about union, right? Union with the object, becoming one with the object of meditation. Right. So none of that is actually mystical. It's just the practical thing that happens when your mind stops dividing stuff up. So the division between objects and subject, right, between this thing over here and that stuff over there, is a conceptual division. What you live in right now is a image that your mind is creating, right? This is according not just to Buddhist texts and Hindu texts. Modern cognitive science would say that this is basically a 3D projection that the mind creates according to the impressions of the senses. But it's not what is actually out there. It's just the impression of the senses appearing as an image to the mind. So your entire environment is just the images of the mind. It's not the environment itself. You following? So the division between what is appearing and that to which it appears, the division between the subject and the object, is something also that the mind creates. And it does that through a conceptual activity. It conceptually divides up me and not me. So when the mind stops engaging in conceptual divisions, because it's highly focused on some activity, then the division between self and other, subject and object, goes away temporarily. It's not mystical, it's practical. When you stop making divisions, everything appears to kind of become part of one thing. So the feeling, this is Geshe Dakpa Tokyal in Charleston, South Carolina. The feeling of the observer as something over there on this side, and the observed object as something over there on the other side, has vanished. The sense consciousnesses, meaning smell, taste, and hearing, and so on, are either in a latent state or in a totally disengaged state in relation to their usual objects. In other words, you cannot see, smell, taste, hear. You have no tactile sensation. You become completely free from every single trace of who you are, and what you have gone through up until now. In other words, your entire self-description, your entire self-image, your entire concept of who and what you are stops temporarily. So the senses have completely turned off, and your autobiography has temporarily completely turned off. Your awareness, experiences, and your sense of being are not divided up into past, present, and future. So time for you temporarily also stops, right? So the only thing that's occurring is just the object of focus. Everything else stops, including the division between me over here and object over there. So when they talk about non-duality, this is the basic level of non-duality. That there is no ultimate separation between you and what appears to you as an object, including other people. Now, this maybe sounds fantastical to some people, and it's okay to be honest about that. My master's degree was basically putting a lot of this material in conversation with what we can know in terms of neurological data and science, and there's actually some interesting science on all this. For example, in neurology, there's something called the default mode network. Highly advanced meditators can reduce the electrical activity, the chemical activity, in the areas of the brain associated with the default mode network when they're engaged in highly focused concentration. This is according to numerous sources in reputable peer-reviewed journals. So what does the default mode network do? Well, according to Taylor et al., 2013, it is responsible for envisioning future scenarios. It's responsible for autobiographical memory. It's responsible for moral decision-making and self-referential processing. In other words, all thoughts related to me, right? So if somebody stops that part of their brain from being active, there's no more, at a minimum, no more future thoughts, no more autobiographical thoughts, so at least no more thoughts about what I am in relation to my past, no more moral thoughts, so no right, no wrong, no up, no down, right? It's just no pure, no impure. It's just simply what appears. So there's no moral judgments taking place, no self-referential processing, so the sense of a self separate from the object temporarily stops. So activity reduction in the default mode network potentially speaks to the markedly reduced conceptual and emotional biases described in the Buddhist texts. More formally, in the Buddhist literature, they would say the delusions, the klesha, associated with the desire realm have been temporarily stopped or made dormant by a suppressing antidote, concentration. You have forced the mind into the form realm through concentration. And while the mind is resting in the form realm, the desire realm afflictions cannot arise. Okay. The next aspect of the definition, which is, I think, quite challenging for Westerners. It was quite challenging for me for many years until I read the wider literature, to be honest, is Shinto Jingwa. So this is pliancy, mental and physical pliancy. So this is the final demarcation of having gained the first access level of concentration, the first form realm concentration. This is how you know that your mind is in the form realm. Shinto Jingwa occurs. So Shinto Jingwa, mental and physical pliancy, has been translated in a huge number of ways. Pliancy can be translated as suppleness, agility, flexibility, or serviceability. I tend to like serviceability, but really what it's talking about is that what you've removed is the ordinary physical and mental dysfunction that make the body grow tired due to exertion, right? When that dysfunction has been removed, then the mind is supple, right? It's serviceable, it's agile, and this means that you can sit unbrokenly in concentration, comfortably abiding on your object for extended periods of time, right? So it is actually the serviceability arising, and this serviceability is accompanied by bliss, right? So there is an extremely pleasurable physical feeling that arises and an extremely pleasurable mental feeling that arises. And accompanying those is mental and physical suppleness. So this basically joy and energy that arises due to the concentration is what gives the body the ability to be exerted for an extended period of time. It also, well, let's continue with the science, because this is probably more interesting to most of you. Okay, so Benson et al., 1990, page 90. There is some question, right? Should be for most of us. If somebody doesn't eat or drink for 10 days, most people are going to die, right? You're probably going to die if you don't eat or drink for 10 days, especially if you're a bit older. This is what science tells us. However, advanced Tibetan meditators, meditators who have spent 10,000 plus hours training in concentration, have been shown in laboratory settings to be able to reduce their metabolism by 64% at will in a laboratory. Now, what does that mean? That means that at a minimum, someone should be able to sit for 20 to 25 days without food, water, at least without food and water, without dying, right? Assuming that this is as low as they can get their metabolism to go. If they can get it to go lower than this, then they should be able to sit much longer without dying. There are other studies also of flow, which indicate in the Western tradition, right? So mostly conducted by this gentleman here and his wife, indicating that when somebody enters a highly concentrated state, they have less mental and physical fatigue. Lutz et al. In 2004 also found that Tibetan yogis with 8,000 plus hours of meditative training have higher resting gamma ratios than control groups, indicating highly focused minds even between formal sessions. Now, this does harmonize with the Gelug literature on the subject, saying that you can basically maintain concentration between sessions is an interesting finding. But more importantly, what these two things are pointing at, in addition to this next section, is that expert meditators have an inverse relationship between their need for sleep and rest and time spent in meditation. Importantly, according to Call et al. And Britton et al., without creating insomnia. Now, this should be pretty remarkable, right? Most people within a week or so of not sleeping will die. That you cannot function without sleep. However, if you can generate genuine states of samadhi, in particular, they would say in the Gelug, if you can get above the fourth form realm samadhi, then your meditation will act as a replacement for sleep. So if you spend an equivalent amount of time meditating as you would have been sleeping, then you no longer need the sleep at all. Now, this is interesting, especially when advanced meditators have highly focused minds between sessions, which means that the amount of energy that the body and mind need to run, basically, is reduced even between sessions. And the metabolism is being kept lower, even between sessions. So now do a little bit of math, right? You have highly advanced meditators who between sessions are maintaining intense states of lucid awareness with some concentration. Their metabolisms are dramatically reduced during sessions and in between sessions relative to normal people. So this seems to be a quite reasonable extrapolation, right? Without having to talk about being able to meditate for years, one could quite reasonably argue that a meditator should be able to sit for several days, right? Without needing the sleep, without needing the water, without needing the food. They should be able to sit probably at least 30 days, right? Based upon this data. So, of course, we didn't really discuss this, but really what the Tibetan technology discusses is that the winds, the lung, the winds actually become a source of nourishment when you're sitting in meditation. So ultimately, you should be able to sit much longer than 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, because the body won't die. It's receiving a different source of metabolic replenishment, the winds. And so it doesn't succumb to the seemingly biological limit. Let's see. My own teacher, when he was getting empowerment, he used to mention how these high lamas, these high Tibetan lamas, they would always wake up early in the morning before all the retreatants woke up during these week-long or 10-day retreats. And before the empowerment started, they had to do all this work to prepare the environment for the empowerment. And so they would spend 2 or so hours doing work, basically mental work and prayers, to prepare the place. And then the empowerment itself would sometimes last between 16 and 20 hours. So the Lama would be sitting up there doing the empowerment, right? And a lot of these high Lamas giving these empowerments they're old, quite old. And my teacher said that the young men, at the end of the first day, could barely walk and move by the end of the day. They were totally spent. He said, but the old Lamas, and I'm quoting here, were fresh as a daisy, and they hopped right up every time, right? Just, okay, on to the next thing. Because concentration also has the effect, and this is quite interesting. A lot of data on this, actually. A lot of scientific data. Bodily pain is also reduced dramatically when you have concentration. And so these elderly lamas, he said, from his own direct experience, never showed any signs of fatigue or bodily pain, even when they were doing week-long, 20-hour or 22-hour days back to back to back. So this is all quite consistent with the literature on gaining pliancy, which is the primary demarcator of having gained calm abiding. So we already discussed a bit the natural condition versus skillfulness. Some people for some people this is probably going to be useful, so I'll talk a bit about this. But this is quite advanced stuff here. So at the level that calm abiding is no longer a technique, the stabilization that you're looking at is a stabilization unearthed, or a stable state that is revealed to be the natural condition of the mind. That is a state in which a person or a mind does not have goals, targets, or specific objects anymore in the training. Which doesn't mean they're not striving in the training. It just means that their training is no longer oriented according to goals and targets. So this is the level of access to the natural condition in which your training is no longer tied to habits that you have. Your training is no longer tied to schedules that you keep. It is even beyond language, it's beyond religion, beyond denomination or sect, beyond philosophy, country, culture, gender, race. There is absolutely no identifying sign or mark that is connected to this level of stabilization of mind, right? For example, Lama Yeshe of FPMT says of Mahamudra training, in Mahamudra meditation, there is no doctrine, no theology, no philosophy, no God, no Buddha. We go beyond name, beyond shape and color, beyond the relative, beyond self-image, beyond compassion, beyond arising, and beyond cessation. with no dimension and no distinct nature, no cause or effect. Mahamudra is the experience of the emptiness of our mind as inseparable from or non-dual with the mind. When we experience Mahamudra, dualistic phenomena no longer operate. When the object breaks down, the concept, the subject, disappears. Having the experience of non-duality is the perfect view. The not seeing of dualistic puzzles is the seeing of perfect unity or totality. My own mentor, right before he passed away, sent this in an email. Like Shamatha, Mahamudra is not really the name of a practice or set of actions leading to something. Mahamudra is a state of mind or awareness. It is the result. It is sometimes a source of confusion that we give the name of the result to the process that we use to get there. Again, Mahamudra is the name designation given to a state of unmitigated basal awareness. Thought and the nature of mind, bliss emptiness, are non-separable aspects of mind or consciousness. Sublimity pervades all awareness. It is just covered over or obstructed. We do not need to create it, we just need to remove the obstruction. At the other end, sublimity and awareness thought are inseparable. Subject and object are equally inseparable. They are different designations given to aspects that are necessary to existence or occurrence in the next moment, to reality itself. The mind knows experiences, and the mind creates as inseparable aspects of the same process. We can see these things as a single process or as multiple aspects of the same process, reality formation, depending on our need and purpose. All newly formed moments of reality can be divided into an extended aspect, meaning a physical aspect made of particles and so on, and a knowing aspect, meaning knowing, luminous, and clear, through a process of designation or naming, even though they are inseparable from one another. In other words, what appears to mind and the mind cannot actually be separated. In Mahamudra, we are looking directly at the nature of the mind, rather than the mental images that are concurrent with that nature. We are looking at the beam of the flashlight rather than what the flashlight simultaneously illuminates. We are looking at the nature of illumination, luminosity, to give rise to, rather than what is being illuminated, has arisen. So, when we're talking about this level of training, it is beyond technique. This is no longer about some technique that you're employing to create a specific outcome. This is about getting stuff out of the way to see what the natural condition of the mind is, right? So this is the same technique. This is the same approach of training. There you go. That is discussed in Zen. So if basically the mind cannot be moved from its own nature, if the mind cannot be moved from the current moment of directly looking at its own nature, then it's in a state of Zen-shin, it's in a state of Fudo-shin. The mind, Shin, embodies a state of readiness for what occurs next, Zan, and immovability, Fudo. It cannot be moved off this particular moment and off its own nature. It's also in a state of Mushin. The mind's not attempting to do something in particular, Mu, right? The mind is not trying to figure anything out, control anything, contrive anything. And in this way, it is choiceless, right? So the mind is not in an active process of deciding between different types of things. It is looking directly at the thing that is giving rise to all of the things, constantly, in the midst of things arising. So that is arguably the natural condition of consciousness, and not some contrived thing you have created in order to get something else done within consciousness, right? However, it still employs gaining the ability to do that, look at that, more or less unify with your own nature, still employs and depends upon the more basic technique or skill of just being able to stop the mind from running all over the place. and making the mind highly bright and lucid so that it's not kind of sleepily doing whatever it's doing. So these are deeply interrelated topics. I hope that's quite clear. Mr. Whitfield's mentor, 10th Dan in Shukokai Karate, Kimura Sensei, referred to accessing the basic level of consciousness as winning mind, right? In the midst of a highly demanding condition, you are fighting for your life, or you're fighting maybe for a high title in a national competition. If you can generate this mind, you have already won in the most important sense. Because the purpose of the martial arts is to gain access to this mind, and to have access to this mind under the most demanding conditions. So it achieves victory without having to strike a blow. Again, this is not some mystical thing. This is practical. The point of the art, what makes martial arts an art and not just martial, is this: that you're gaining access to the fundamental condition of the creation of reality. And you're understanding what's actually going on, and you're remaining unified with that. So it cuts the internal enemy, it hits the proper target without a single arrow leaving the bow. That's what a lot of these expressions are referring to. So this level of discussion, I think, is quite puzzling for beginners, often also quite puzzling for intermediate students. And therefore, it is much easier to just think about combining as a skill for a long time, a technique, a method. It's something that you need, it's some work that you need to get done in order to do important stuff on the path. And indeed, you're going to use your whatever level of sort of calm-abiding pedagogical accomplishment you attain, whatever level of focus you can generate prior to having calm abiding, in other words, you're going to be using that as an instrument to gain other realizations on the path. So more or less, you're not really going to be using it as like at this really high level of the natural condition of mind for quite some time. So I think using the term skillful in the original definition is justified. As I said before, it's also difficult to see how one could gain an experience of these much more difficult types of meditative accomplishment without first having some experience of calm abiding as a skill. Quite a bit here we could say about some of these more advanced techniques, but let's see what I want to say. There's a lot of danger if one jumps straight into the more advanced technique of trying to access the nature of mind as the natural condition, as the first type of training, because it has a tendency to magnify your worst problems right out of the gate. It has a tendency to negate ethics. It has a tendency to make one think there is really nothing else to be done other than just trying to look at the mind directly. And frankly, I don't know of anyone who has gained a high level of accomplishment through taking the road of simply trying to do the non-dual thing all by itself without any other training. Now, I could be wrong about this. There may be people that are like that. Maybe there is the rare person who's properly oriented right from the beginning. They encounter good teachers and bang, zoom, they're out of here. That probably is a thing. But if you're watching videos on YouTube to try to learn about meditation, that's probably not you. And I had the opportunity to train with good teachers. And I can tell you, it's not me either. And I trained hard with those teachers. I trained sincerely for a long time. And I can tell you, I still need to do all the other work of the path so that this part of it will work properly. So my advice is follow the dual methods first. Develop ethics. Develop strong habits in a positive direction. Yeah. Then, on the basis of having good character, being a good person, having good ethics, having discipline in your schedule, in your life, in ordinary types of ability to get things done, then on that basis, pursue these more difficult types of training. Because then you have a real shot at bringing them to fruition. Without that basis, for most people, the vast, vast majority of people, I don't see how you could get it done. So I think we'll probably conclude this and then circle back around and just recap what we talked about today. So meditation is really only dangerous if you can do it. But meditation, if you can do it, is extremely dangerous. It should be fairly obvious that if you can gain access to fundamental aspects of your own consciousness and then screw around with them, that's a dangerous proposition. There are quite a few very sincere, very driven meditators who have lost their marbles, including notable examples in the Western world. Training really, really hard in meditation without knowing what you're doing can physically damage you permanently. It can psychologically damage you permanently. So if you know what you're doing and you have good mentors, good teachers, good instructions at hand, and you ramp up your training appropriately, then the results can be very stable, very profound. But if you have more determination than good sense, if you have more oomph than wisdom, there is a great deal of damage you can do to yourself. So you need to be quite careful, right? Calm abiding is an advanced practice. The non-dual versions of the training are extremely advanced practices. So if you're already involved in that and you have certain practice commitments or whatever you've taken on, fine. Do not give up the training commitments and things that you've made. That's very unwise. At the same time, if you need to take 25 steps backwards because you've gotten yourself involved in the most advanced technology ever invented by the human mind, and maybe even beyond the human mind, then do that so that you lay the foundations appropriately for the type of realization and type of meditative technology you're working with. Which really means going back to the beginning, relying on your teachers properly, developing motivations properly, doing a lot more work with things like good habits, good ethics, good character, schedule, becoming capable in the ordinary sense, right? Making your body more functional so that you can actually physically do the training that's being asked of you, those sorts of things. Today, if you had the thought that nothing exists at all, that probably wouldn't do much, right? Because you have a lot of other thoughts, a lot of other ideas pop into your head, and they just don't have a lot of oomph. They don't have a lot of psychological force. If you have calm abiding, and you can generate a single pointed state of concentration and hold states of concentration for a week or weeks or months at a time, and you think nothing exists, and you hold that in concentration for a really long period of time, the psychological damage will be extensive and long-lasting, right? So meditation's only dangerous if you can do it, or if you have way more determination than you have good sense and good technique and good mentorship. Really, the primary function of a mentor is to stop you from making really terrible mistakes in your training process. That's the primary function. So whatever system you're involved in today, make sure that you have a good teacher. Make sure your teacher has the accomplishments that you want to have, or at a minimum, they have some experience combined with really good scholarly understanding of what the process is. Because that's the primary cause for you to make it all the way to the end of this process. Calm abiding is one small piece. Stabilizing meditation is one small piece in a much bigger project of training. It's not the end of anything. Even in advanced forms of meditation like Mahamudra, very often one is first gaining calm abiding or gaining gaining a lot of technique, sort of driven stabilizing meditation, using a focal object like the breath or a visualized image first. So even in the non-dual methods, right, one is first, very often in the pedagogies, in the training systems where the non-dual methods exist, using some other method first to get enough experience in all the way up to calm abiding, or, close, that you can then recognize the natural state and abide in the natural state. So, for example, in the Kagyu, they would call this meditation with support, in my understanding of their technique. And then they would call the non-dual sort of meditation without support. Also, a lot of people, they want the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness teachings, the non-dual teachings, the final teachings, the fastest, the biggest, the best, because they want it to happen now, right? They want the results right away. But there are some really funny Zen sayings about this, as Zen sayings tend to go, where they say things like instant enlightenment occurs after 60 years of dedicated, rigorous study and training. So if you take on a method that's too difficult or too subtle, it's worse than useless, as the Tibetans are fond of saying. So the approach that's going to be taken in this text is not the non-dual method. It is the dual method. It is meditation with support. It's meditation as a skill. If you want to do those other types of meditations, they are quite profound. If you're already involved in those, maintain your commitments. But it's important to know that you can't actually do these more difficult types of meditation unless you can do this type. Yeah, you need to already have a lot of concentration, ability to control the mind, to then recognize what the mind is and rest in what the mind already is. I think that should be obvious. If you can't stop the mind from running all over the place, how are you going to recognize what the mind is and rest in that? I mean, that's absurd. Okay, so that's enough on meditation as a skill versus the natural condition. So to recap today we defined what meditation is, right? We talked about who Lama Tsongkhapa is, what he's basing his teachings on. We defined meditation in the Western tradition. Again, very diverse term, so we narrowed it down. We narrowed it down to Gom or Bhavana. And within Gom or Bhavana, there are two types. There is Shyiné or Shamatha meditation, and there is Latong. This text is going to be dealing only with Shyiné meditation, we said. The definition for Shyiné meditation, Shamatha, meditation is mental and physical pliancy arising from a highly sturdy, highly lucid, unbiased, and skilled state of mind which can hold attention uninterrupted on a beneficial object for as long as it wishes, while cognizing without conceptually adding or distracting properties from its object. Abhidharma literature also stresses that you have to be familiarizing with a beneficial object because concentrations based upon attachment and aversion, which we have all the time, are not actually helpful. And they are not of the same character as concentrations not based upon those. Spend a lot of time defining the definition, right? We hopefully are convinced that talking about shamatha as a trained skill is a useful thing to do. Shamatha is not just sitting around blanked out, which will make you stupider than you are now. It's not a helpful practice. We talked about not conceptually adding and subtracting qualities. We talked about what happens when you stop adding and subtracting qualities, that slowly, the five senses will turn off. If you're visualizing an image, slowly the other five senses will turn off. The mental sense will predominate. Even if you're using a physical support like the breath, you will eventually lose every single trace of who you are, every single trace of a sense of there being a passage of time beyond whatever change is occurring in the object. If it's a visualized image, there's no change. If it's the breath, there's change. So time won't go away. Time won't go away, but there will only be the present moment. Time goes away if you're using a visualized image. We also talked about a lot of science. Basically, science says that the default mode network turns off in advanced meditators or is dramatically reduced activity in the default mode network. In other words, the Buddhist texts have been verified by science, more or less. We talked about Shinto Jingma, which is mental and physical pliancy. Basically, the bliss and the physical and mental energy, so the physical and mental bliss and the physical and mental energy that arise from deep familiarization with concentration at the level of the form realm. More or less, we discussed all the pieces of this and hopefully came to the conclusion that a person who can dramatically reduce their metabolism, who has less mental and physical fatigue, who even during their resting states has a highly focused mind and has a reduced need for sleep without causing insomnia, should be able to maintain a highly lucid, awake, concentrated state of mind for a long period of time, meaning probably weeks, maybe even months. The Tibetans would say you can do this for years, because part of the technology that they're using relies on wind, prana, chi, ki, lung, whatever you want to call it, kundalini. It relies upon energy of a different sort than the sort that we're dealing with at the level of protons, neutrons, and electrons and the nuclear forces. So, nourishment is coming from this other source, and therefore food and water can be basically ignored, and sleep can be ignored for extended periods, meaning years at a time. Even if you never attain that level, certainly you should at some point attain a level of concentration where, in the midst of extremely demanding ordinary activities, meaning like 10, 22-hour days in a row, that you can be fresh as a daisy for the entire duration of that activity without any sign of fatigue or bodily pain, right? Which means that you can do whatever kind of training you want, which is the whole point of gaining pliancy. The whole point of gaining a mind and body that is serviceable is being able to use it to do something. In other words, to gain realization for your own sake, for the sake of all beings. So that is it for today. Thank you again for tuning into Modern Western Buddhism. My name is Jared Jones. If you're finding what I'm presenting useful to you, I do have a Patreon, which will be in the links below. And the money that goes into that Patreon is solely used to support my own practice, my PhD research, and to donate to Buddhist causes. So when I need to go on retreats, when I need to get books for my own training, when I need to advance my Tai Chi practice, that is the fund that I will be drawing funds from. When I want to donate to FBMT to keep monks and nuns alive in various places around the planet so that they can do their training, those are the funds that I draw from. So your contributions there will not only be of benefit to my own personal practice, but also the practice of some other Buddhists, and in that way, quite meaningful. So if you'd like to support what I do, then please do contribute to the Patreon. Otherwise, I hope that all of you who are unable to contribute will continue finding these videos quite useful and helpful to your own training in whatever system you happen to be training in. It is my hope that this Gelug presentation, or primarily Gelug presentation, will be of some use to not just fellow Gelug, but to, sorry, I lost my connection for a second. Well, in any case, that it will be helpful to anyone living in the modern world who's had a modern education and is living as a layperson. That's the whole idea. Thank you again, and I hope to be seeing you all again soon. Please send me an email or a message if you have any questions. Happy to answer questions as time